To the degree that we can talk about the American church as a whole, has not been on the front lines of this movement. And I think a lot of that is because we're listening only to speak in a certain way rather than listening genuinely to the concerns of our communities, the
Mhm.
concerns and issues of our society at large, and then turning to, and this is where my evangelical comes out, but to the person of Jesus and to the scriptures and saying, what within our tradition, what within our faith, um, what within the way that God has revealed God's self to us, um, can we draw out in order to support and engage in our communities and in society as a whole? And so our inability to have conversations, and that happens both within the church, because our local congregations feel so divided that how could there, even within a single community, be a unified effort towards something when the congregation is divided against itself, let alone for the church in America, which is in its own way, at a macro level divided against itself, um, able to, in any sort of unified or uniform way, speak to our society. And so I think uh, we need to begin that work of listening well, and then going back to the scriptures and asking genuinely for God to show up in these spaces. And of course, the Spirit is already present there. There's no doubt about that. The way that I often try to approach it is having the holy curiosity to see the Spirit at work in the most unexpected of spaces. Um, and when and it's a struggle. I'm far from perfect at doing this, but I'm constantly surprised at where the Spirit is working, in people's lives. Within the Christian tradition, people who are outside of the Christian tradition, who are doing this work that I think Jesus is calling us to. And so I'm constantly learning from those people, from those communities. Uh, and I think that's something that, in response to our inability to have conversation, is something that I think we can all be praying for, and hoping will grow in each of us and in our communities, is this holy curiosity to see how the Spirit is already moving, in our world today, and then following in that, rather than trying to trade or blaze our own paths, that and hope that the Spirit follows us or will jump ahead of us. Instead, saying, "Where's God already at work, and how can we join in join in that?"
Do you think that that sense of, well, one, I guess maybe the basic question is asked is, do you see that curiosity as a spiritual value that is important for the Christian life in general?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we see Jesus constantly asking questions. Um, Jesus is God, so there's a bit of a difference. Jesus is asking questions, maybe not necessarily to hear an exact answer, but to evoke something out of the person, who's being asked the question. But I think the scripture is filled with people who are curious about what God is doing. Um, and often those are people who are outside of the Christian tradition, outside of being a follower of Jesus, um, who that curiosity leads them to ask questions, and then they encounter Jesus.
Hmm.
Or in the Hebrew Bible, they encounter God or the people of God. And they want to be a part of that. They want to be a part of this community. And so I certainly see that as a spiritual virtue, as something sacred, to develop this holy curiosity.
One of the things that I've listened to this in another podcast, and I've heard it before, is how kind of our political polarization, one of the reasons that it's so fraught is that our politics are our identity. So that
Mhm.
if someone critiques your viewpoint, then it's not simply that they're critiquing, liberalism or conservatism, but they're critiquing or condemning or whatever you.
Yeah.
Um, do you see that happening within the church? And how is that detrimental? Do you think? How do you see? how is it detrimental to our kind of our Christian faith when we do that?
Yeah, I see that uh, quite a bit, and I think that moves back to these. Uh, I'm lost my train of thought there. Can you repeat, what was the first half of your question? You worded it really well.
Well, it's basically that we have, instead of, someone saying, yeah, I'm a Democrat or I'm a Republican, that, those are kind of, they've become basically our identities. They've merged
Yes,
in some way so that any type of attack or critique becomes personal because it's critiquing us. And I guess
yes.
my question is, how has that affected kind of the witness of the church?
Yes, absolutely. That is a lot of what I was looking at when I was doing all of this work in American religious history.
Hmm.
My focus was on post World War II American evangelicalism. So, if you wanted to talk about political identity being tied to a religious tradition, I mean, there's I think few examples that are greater than the conservative, evangelical Christian right. Trying to get a literal foot in the door of the Oval Office to influence politics and government and culture. And we see the detriment of that. We see its lasting impact today. We see the way that it demonizes certain people, the way that it has to manipulate certain events around us that should be terrible on their own account. Um, and so, for example, framing the Cold War as a battle against the Christian America versus the demonic USSR, the demonic communists, um, and I'm not making the argument for like communist Christianity, uh, but at the same time, the strategy was not to be concerned about a nuclear war, but about elevating the morality of the United States through this very specific uh, brand and practice of American Christianity and welding those two things together in order to influence the culture. And again, you can look to what is motivating that. A lot of it is fear. A lot of it is the desire for preservation coming out of the modernist fundamentalist controversy, where uh, the the fundamentalists win in the legal court but lose in the court of public opinion. Um, Go back and spend 30 or so years just like building out these institutions so that they're able to then enter the public square, and then you get the moral majority. And you see that running through the 70s, through the 90s, and then all of a sudden we're in the 2000s. And you're seeing this on ramp to what eventually becomes the 2016 election. And so much of this is tied to the way that religious tradition and political party become one singular identity, where one can't be critiqued without the other. And so when today I, preach at a church, I will at times preach at my father-in-law's church, which is again, fundamentalist, independent Baptist church, and I'm this brown kid who's getting up to preach, and I am constantly again thinking about audience and going, how do I say this in a way that is palatable? Because whatever I say is going to be interpreted now through two lenses. Again, going back to what you were saying earlier about the perception of who am I, because I am not a white Baptist on this, behind this pulpit, the assumption of liberal values that are often going to be seen in a really negative light. My public writing and my credentials, in some ways, uh, will only solidify that in certain people's minds. But at the same time, that's why uh, I was really intentional after Moody of going to a place like Princeton. Moody, I kind of fell into. I didn't really know what I was getting myself into when I ended up there. I'm glad I was there, but I knew that if I wanted to represent myself well, uh, and especially when it comes to people just looking at my educational background, where I've learned, the places I've been formed, that Moody is not representative